Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to the Redneck Gone Green podcast. My name is Shahid Buttar. I'm going to be guest hosting today to give host David Cobb a chance to focus on some other fronts. I've been grateful for the chance to join David a few times in the past and was excited to receive his invitation. We're looking forward to a great discussion today featuring Stephen Semler. He's the co-founder of the Security Policy Reform Institute. It's a grassroots U.S. foreign policy think tank that is quite critical of the dominant consensus in Washington. And he also writes an incredibly insightful column on Substack titled Polygraph. I highly recommend it to everyone. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here. Happy to talk with you.
Yeah, I wish we had more happy things to talk about. Obviously, this week is celebrating what some people in the sort of punditocracy are describing as an anniversary. And it's certainly the anniversary of the world's attention to some events that have been unfolding in the Middle East, particularly. But maybe let's just start with a question as to, is this week an anniversary of anything? It certainly is of the Hamas attacks on October 7th, 2023, that shocked the Israeli security establishment. If we were to locate the beginning of the unfolding genocide in Gaza, is that an appropriate place, you would think, to sort of start the clock, so to speak?
The Biden-Harris administration certainly thinks so. Once you notice that there's a common refrain in the Biden administration, whether it's, some State Department lackey, someone like Patel, for example, from the State Department, or the guy with the incredibly punchable face, can't remember his name, Matthew Miller. They always say this whole thing began on October 7th, when Hamas terrorists massacred 1,200 people in Israel. I mean, it's a common refrain. Once you notice it, everyone does it. Biden does it. Kamala Harris has done it, I think, in at least one, definitely in one debate and in several interviews so far. And they do that to deny the reality of the occupation, to make it seem like Hamas had no means or had no reason to engage in this slaughter. And you can criticize their tactics. I certainly have. But when you're talking about October 7th, you have to put it in a certain framework and in a certain context, and that context is being ignored. For example, 2023, deadliest year for Palestinian children in, I think, 2 decades, or maybe 10 or 15 years, something like that. Then for administrative detention, a number of which we'll get into later, the amount of Palestinians held without charge or trial, detained arbitrarily, i.e. hostages. The number of Palestinians held in Israeli administrative detention broke a 30-year high in September. And one of the main justifications for the Hamas attack was to free Palestinian prisoners. So you can go, I just went back to 2023. I'm sure you have examples from all the way back to 1948.
Right. When people talk about terrorism in the Middle East with a lens towards, particularly terrorism on the side of one side of the conflict or the other, turning a blind eye to state terrorism. When I think about the history of terrorism in the Middle East, it is hard for me to ignore the Nakba. And of course, that's a historical moment that is widely suppressed by American journalists and the editors who sort of steer them. Is there anything you want to say about that sort of deeper history and how it set up the longstanding marginalization and denial of human rights to which arguably the attacks on October 7th last year responded?
Well, it set up the conditions for displacement, eventually apartheid, for violent land grab. It normalized it, and it created the reality of the occupation that has existed since then. And is, time doesn't pass as much as it builds up. And I think that's the key thing to remember when you reference 1948. It's an ongoing Nakba. So when you hear the numbers comparing the 1948 expulsion and massacre of Palestinian people from their land and today's numbers that are going on now, it's part of the shared story. So it's not these two isolated events that happened at the same time that were both bad. It was part of the continuing process, I would say. But the one thing I would say that's different today is that the U.S. policy is more extreme than it has ever been. I mean, consider, yes, the U.S. supported the creation of Israel, as it did many other countries in the UN. But the U.S. had an arms embargo on Israel and Arab states in 1947 and 1948. And throughout time, when things just got a little bit too bad, a little bit too egregious, a little bit too PRN friendly on the Israeli front in terms of the crimes they committed against Palestinians, there was always some sort of U.S. pressure to back off a little bit. It hasn't helped Palestinians in the long run, but certainly prevented, outright, full-scale, discrete genocide like we're seeing now. And that's just not happening now.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the things that really strikes me when you talk about the American policy in this point in history being more permissive to Israel and inviting human rights violations to an even greater extent than in the past. Now, I'm struck by the contrast, particularly between Reagan and Biden, where Reagan, when he did briefly suspend some weapon shipments, particularly advanced F-16s to Israel in response to an Israeli attack on Iran at the time, and that was the era when the U.S. started supplying Saudi Arabia with advanced fighter jets over Israeli objections. And so you see in the Reagan era, and I'm no fan of Ronald Reagan, just to be clear, but this right-wing figure who's lionized as supposedly a foreign policy visionary, he was much more willing to restrain Israel and to change U.S. foreign policy to hold Israel accountable for decisions that failed to respect human rights. When I look at the Biden administration, repeatedly announcing red lines, for instance, over the availability of humanitarian aid, or any number of red lines that repeatedly get crossed. It seems that the administration today, despite being under a Democratic administration, is decidedly more hawkish and decidedly less willing to assert itself and reasonable limits to respect international human rights than were even Republican presidents in the last generation.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, you're right to bring up Reagan too, because if you're falling to the right, if you want to call it right, of Reagan on this, then we have a serious problem. And, in addition to the weapons transfers that you mentioned, some were just temporary. But I remember one on this ban of cluster munitions transfers to Israel that lasted, I think less than like 5 or 6 years or something, due to their use in civilian areas. So now, what has been the pause in weapons transfers now, or there's been 0 formal suspensions of arms sales to Israel. There's been hundreds of expedited sales, and there's been one pause, just a pause, doesn't mean a suspension or anything, or revoke, of a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs that the Biden administration had already provided the same type of 2,000-pound bomb, over 14,000 of these same types of 2,000-pound bombs before. So it's really just a performative stunt, while the Reagan cutoff actually had meaning, and he actually threatened in a serious way to cut off U.S. military systems. Didn't he tell the Israeli PM at the time that he actually used the word Holocaust?
I was not aware of that, but
I think
remarkable.
He actually described the scene in Beirut, because it was just horrible shelling. This was the second time in like 4 or 5 years that Israel invaded Lebanon to try to eradicate the PLO, and then this time created Hezbollah, which people seem to forget too.
Right.
So, but Reagan allegedly picked up the phone, called Begin, I think, mentioned Begin, Mechaim Begin. I forget. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he said, "Look, this is a Holocaust," because the images were coming out of Beirut were just catastrophic. And I mean, it's not a competition of which images coming out were worse than out of Beirut or now out of Gaza. I mean,
right.
But it was enough for Reagan to call it a Holocaust.
And the contrast is jarring, right? Because we look at Gaza today, and the scale of the destruction is at least on par with what Beirut experienced then. And it's interesting that, in the past year, most of what we've been talking about when we do look at the Middle East is a genocide in Gaza. And in the past few weeks, Israel has expanded it to begin bombing countries, including Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Yemen. This expansion of what was merely a genocide targeting one civilian population under Israel's military occupation has now become seemingly the crucible of perhaps a third world war. And the contrast between a Republican president recognizing what he described in his own words apparently as a Holocaust 40 years ago, and a Democratic president today turning a blind eye to the human rights principles that are being ground into the dirt, along with tens of thousands of Palestinian lives and potentially an entire culture, is, as an observer of American politics, to me, it indicates not only some very dramatic failings in Washington, but also just a really profound and largely unobserved leap to the right, where today's Democrats stand to the right of yesterday's Republicans. Does that seem accurate to you?
It seems so to me. I mean, even I haven't done a comparison of like a Republican Party platform from the 1980s compared to the Democratic Party of 2024's, but I have compared the Democratic Party in 2020 versus the 2024 edition.
Okay.
Have you looked at them at all? Like ever?
Not finally parsing them. No, I've been watching it more through the lens of current events, but I'd be eager to hear what you
I would love to
think of
what
that
you
contrast.
think, honestly. But so here's what I picked up. I didn't look at the domestic section too much, but enough to skim and draw this conclusion from the domestic section. Wildly unambitious domestically and incredibly hawkish on foreign policy. Wildly. So the 2020 platform actually had some good things in it. It said that the U.S. should reduce its military expenditures. It criticized Trump's, I think they said his spending on vanity projects, that sort of thing, on nuclear weapons. And then the Democrats faulted Trump for escalating in the Middle East. And the 2024 edition of it is basically them listing all of the things Biden did, which are basically copying Trump's policies, and then they applaud him for it. It's wild.
Right.
So
right.
But going back to what you're saying, as just a brief digression there, but it is a leap to the right. And it's not just, the tolerance for human rights abuses. It's that it's just completely divorced from any realpolitik justification either. There's no, like, pretty soon, I think, you might have pointed this out before, but it was clear that the Biden-Harris administration decided at some point that they were not going to let their Israel policy be constrained in any way by international or domestic law when it came to arming Israel's atrocities in Gaza. They were just, that's it. But they were.
Can we put a fine point on this? I'm thinking about when Blinken testified before the House, and he sort of rejected the findings of the State Department about Israel's failure to comply with human rights, which would have given Congress an opportunity to restrict weapons transfers. But Blinken, showing up before Congress, sort of, lying through his teeth before the American public, denying what the entire world is seeing on our screens. I mean, that seemed like a one moment in time exemplifying this pattern that you're describing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and I think that was in May. Are you referring to the report that the State Department released in May? And I think there's the testimony associated with that. Yeah, that report. One of the most obvious ones was that it concluded that Israel wasn't blocking humanitarian aid, and then Blinken, after the ProPublica report was released like a week or two ago, Blinken went on TV, or was asked on some TV interview, and he said, "Oh, well, there's competing opinions within State Department." No, that's not what the ProPublica article was saying. I mean, it was if the ProPublica article was just saying that there were some people in the State Department that said Israel was definitely blocking humanitarian aid, that was old news. Where it added value is that it showed that the State Department, the department that's in charge of arms transfer specifically and leadership, basically forced each agency within State Department to sign off and say Israel wasn't blocking humanitarian aid. So I don't think he referenced reports saying Israel wasn't. He received information that Israel wasn't. That's impossible. He was absolutely lying about that, unless it was like a forced confession or something from a State Department, bureaucrat. Because every humanitarian organization in the world, including the one I used to work for, although I was involved in the Syria response, every single one said that Israel's blocking humanitarian aid. And you can look at the trucks being held at the border. You can look at the ones that get inside but are held very close to the border by Israeli authorities and aren't granted access. The ones that are attacked by Israeli forces.
Outright, unapologetically, despite notice of the convoys. I mean, that to me seems especially egregious. I mean, and it's somewhat pithy to expect an American restraint on that kind of activity when the U.S. has done that too, right? I mean, the Pentagon bombed Médecins Sans Frontières operations in Kabul, if I recall correctly. So, it's like we're asking one relentlessly human rights abusing country to check another. So maybe that's a little bit too much to expect. But this idea that the State Department's career diplomats are being overruled by political appointees who are basically effectuating exactly what you described, a Biden-Harris commitment to support Israel, regardless of the facts that emerged on the ground. That really does seem to me to suggest that the policy in Washington is effectively institutionally oblivious. It's like no one particularly cares what the facts are. Biden and Harris have made this political decision to back a foreign proxy power come hell or high water. And now the rest of the world is unfortunately being dragged into the hell that policy invites.
Yeah. And it's, not helping Blinken's case is the number of resignations that there's been. There've been about a dozen of them. They're losing like their key people, including people, literally in charge of signing off on weapons authorizations, Josh Paul, or formerly in the State Department. But one thing that is, so I get your point about U.S., not holding Israel accountable for attacking aid workers. One thing, though, in the report, and that's come up, is this 620I, the section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which basically might literally say, the U.S. shall not provide any assistance to any country blocking U.S. humanitarian aid. Okay. So that was like a legal statute that was specifically addressed in the report that came up fairly early on in the conflict once Israel announced a total siege of Gaza on, October 8th or 9th or whatever of last year. I don't think the Biden-Harris administration was prepared for that legal authorization, and I doubt their team many of them had even heard of it, because it's such an obscure authorization. Like, think about this. For this law to be in effect, you have to be receiving U.S. military assistance or economic assistance in some way, but then also willingly obstruct U.S. humanitarian aid, which is like, those two things just have never, I can't think of another time they've coexisted. Because, there's plenty of countries who block humanitarian aid, like Syria, for example. Bashar al-Assad has blocked humanitarian aid, of course.
But they're not taking U.S. weapons shipments while they're doing it. Right.
Exactly. They're not being fully funded to do that. And we're cases now where, U.S. military aid is being used to obstruct U.S. military humanitarian aid. So it's just a wild thing that just came out of the periphery that makes this so historically just baffling.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's layers to how, that pattern, because at the same time that we see Israel accepting American weapons while denying American humanitarian aid, there's a similar pattern here of Israel receiving very critical support from key figures in Washington like Biden, while refusing to accept any even vestigial restrictions announced by those figures on the way those weapons are used. So it's both an institutional, international sort of distrust and disrespect, but it's also, it strikes me as, and when we look at the upcoming election in November, which is, in some parts of the country already effectively underway, with vote by mail periods having already begun. And it does seem to me that, well, I want to back into this. I don't want to just state it. Let's set this up for people. Before October 7th, 2023, through the spring and summer of last year, there were massive protests in Israel, not in any way related to Hamas, but rather to Netanyahu and his legendary, continuing, and entirely unapologetic corruption. Can you share anything about the sort of domestic crisis surrounding the proposed judicial reforms, which were ultimately implemented in Israel, and how that shifted the Israeli state, but particularly Netanyahu's sort of domestic political position before the Hamas attacks a year ago?
I can't really quote, book and verse about what laws he broke or even provide that much context, but I know this. So this is why essentially you have to force Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire, which means using U.S. leverage, which the Biden-Harris administration refuses to use. You have to cut off the means of support, the money, the weapons specifically, because Netanyahu, if he accepts a ceasefire on his own, which he won't do unless the U.S. cuts off aid, then his very right-wing, he's very right-wing, but even more right-wing counterparts, his governing coalition will fall apart. The right-wing, the far right-wing will back off. His governing coalition will fall apart. He'll no longer have immunity, and he'll be charged with corruption and probably imprisoned. Is that your read on it?
Absolutely. And maybe just to put a few more wheels on the car, there's a really remarkable parallel between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, to the extent that you've got, in one case a former and the other a current head of state, who are twisting state policy to serve their personal ends. And the idea of political self-preservation through genocide is essentially what Netanyahu's been pursuing. In the early part of 2023, Netanyahu had proposed some judicial reforms that basically would and did ultimately marginalize the Israeli judiciary, centralizing power in the executive branch in Israel. And so you can think about this not just as a political change, not just as a policy change, but that as a constitutional change in Israel, shifting it. There's this long-running pretense, certainly in Israel, that it's a democracy. And, if you zoom in, the facts don't necessarily support that, but they support it even less now than they did before, because the centralization of power in the executive branch runs very counter to the contemporary modern image of democracy as relying on divided powers, right? Like the legislative, judicial, executive branch. In Israel, the executive has been, I dare say, catastrophically empowered in the last 2 years. And this preceded the Hamas attacks on October 7th. And in the time since then, I think you're absolutely right to describe Netanyahu's political interests as inhering in continuing the conflict. Another piece of background that might be useful for American viewers to understand is that Israel and most other countries that claim to be democracies around the world have parliamentary systems, which is to say, unlike the US, where they have separate elections for executive offices, the executive branch only serves at the will of the legislature, and the Israeli Knesset is incredibly divided and factionalized. And so Netanyahu's position as prime minister relies on his ability to keep his right-wing coalition partners in the fold. And just as you described, if he were to display any modicum of interest in supporting international human rights, many of those coalition partners would likely defect, leave his coalition, drive him out of power. And just like you described, and just like a former American head of state experienced, once out of power, there's an exposure to prosecution, criminal prosecution, that in both Netanyahu and Trump's case is long overdue. But this idea that Netanyahu is avoiding criminal prosecution for corruption by waging a genocide on civilian populations, unilaterally initiating international conflict with multiple neighboring countries, while its principal enabler, Washington, stands back and sits on its hands watching this all go down, mumbling concerns about human rights. It's not just farcical, it's not just outrageous, but this parallel in between the figures of Trump and Netanyahu strike me as very compelling and also unappreciated. I don't think that most Americans watching what's happening in the Middle East recognize that Netanyahu is doing in Israel what Trump tried to do here in the United States. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts there about the parallel between those figures.
I thought those were brilliant. I thought that was an absolutely brilliant segment. That's why I was so excited to talk to you, because I knew there would be at least one of those moments on this conversation.
Right. You flatter me. You flatter me.
I've been paying attention to Gaza for the last 365 days. I've actively tried not to think about Trump, but now I have to because the election's coming. But right. I hadn't made that parallel. Part of what you're saying sounds like the discourse coming from the families of the Israeli hostages throughout time, saying that, they met with Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and they met with Netanyahu fairly early on. This was when Netanyahu was still pretending to give a shit about the hostages.
Right.
And they were screaming at him. Like, this was, I think, November, maybe December, when, one hostage I remember saying was, I'm not prepared to sacrifice my son for your career, referring to Netanyahu staying in power. And then there's some other quotes that are unrelated, but I'll mention them now just because I'll forget. But one actually delivered testimony saying that when she was held in the Hamas tunnels as a hostage, these people were okay. So it had to be in December because they were freed as part of the late November ceasefire deal that had 105 hostages released in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, 100, 200, or something like that. But in this meeting, she was saying that she was almost killed by Israeli airstrikes multiple times. And then she also referenced being shot at by an Israeli helicopter on her way to Gaza. So throughout this entire experience for these hostages and their families, they've been, literally assaulted by the Israeli state. And again, hostage taking is a war crime, that being, all that being said, but this is clearly not hostage rescue. One thing, it's for, Israeli officials throughout the hostages, they send delegates to their family. I think the analogy that I think of is that Israeli politicians use the hostages in the same way that American politicians, specifically in the Biden-Harris administration, use humanitarian aid. They reference it as some sort of, they talk about it as if it's a central objective, but if you look at what they actually do,
right,
then that's clearly, humanitarianism is clearly not the point. If you've enabled Israel to carpet bomb Gaza as the Allied forces did Dresden during World War II, or worse. And it's clearly not a hostage rescue mission if you're carpet bombing Gaza like the Allied forces did during World War II. So,
right. So on two levels there, if I can invite you to disaggregate this, I mean, just the idea of airstrikes as a tactic to try to recover hostages is clearly incomprehensible, right? I mean, you can't free hostages by bombing entire buildings, right? It's not a terribly tailored method of killing people. It's a pretty, it's more blunt instrument than that. But then separate from that, it does seem to me when you were talking about the Israeli citizen who was taken hostage and then released, talking about being fired on by Israeli helicopters when she was being abducted, that seems to me to be a reflection of an official Israeli state policy, right? That the Hannibal Directive in particular directs the Israeli Defense Forces to do exactly that. Is there anything you want to share about the Hannibal Directive and how it relates to this pretense to care about the lives of the hostages?
Well, I can't speak to the history or even how it got its name. However, the purpose of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is just it's better to kill Israeli, in the Israeli context, it's better to kill Israeli, people being taken hostage than allow them to be taken hostage. That was essentially the order. So the order on October 7th from Israeli forces, and this is treated as a conspiracy, like I see it like, some, proud Zionists online who have the, Israeli flag next to their profile or whatever, they say it's conspiracy, but everything I've read on it, there's been so many reports, verified by Israeli sources citing Israeli members of their armed forces, of members of the IDF, current and former, and hostage testimonies as well. It was very clear. And if you look at the extent of the damage, it was just Hamas is somewhat well armed. The damage would be impossible. That we saw on October 7th inside Israel would be possible without Apache helicopters, without sophisticated artillery, without tanks. And there's numerous
melted cars, for instance, right? You can't melt a car with small arms fire, right? Like that requires something much bigger that Israel has that Hamas does not.
Yeah, and like Israeli helicopters, helicopter pilots were describing to, I forget which Israeli outlet, but they're describing basically chaos and confusion, and then a somewhat structured attempt to figure out which cars were, had Hamas fighters in it, which had hostages, which were, just being driven ordinarily by Israeli civilians away, but they're just to fire on all vehicles, just to fire on all of them. So to me, again, this is like, you bring it up and people are like, oh no, that doesn't happen. But it definitely did. I mean, it absolutely did. And I haven't seen a total casualty estimate. Based on like all the testimony that I've read, I'd hazard a guess of, I don't know, at least 100 were killed by I mean, what's your sense on all of this?
Well, it seems to me that there's at least two phases. There's the immediate aftermath of the attacks on October 7th, when I think you're right that there was seemingly an official policy to just kill everything that moved and count the bodies later. But then in the time since then, it strikes me that if the Hannibal Directive was driving the Israeli Defense Forces to outright kill Israeli citizens rather than allow them to be taken hostage, the airstrike bombing campaign of the last 12 months is a continuation of that strategy, because there's no pretense that there's an ability to separate two different people in a building that's getting destroyed by a cluster bomb, right? And so when we think about the application of the Hannibal Directive, there's the obvious moment in time in the immediate response to the attacks. But in the years since then, this disrespect and disregard for the lives of hostages on both sides of the conflict has been reiterated time and time again. And one of my central frustrations watching all this go down is the pretense among American journalists about Israeli claims to respect the lives of hostages or to desire their return as actually sincere, because it's clear, it has been clear from the very beginning of Israel's response to the attack. So it's been clear for a year that there has been no interest in recovering hostages. There have been multiple ceasefire agreements. negotiated with the help of international partners, including the United States, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, which would have returned Israeli hostages to Israel, that Netanyahu has flatly refused to sign, despite the seeming availability of what he has claimed from the beginning to be his central objective. And so this disingenuity, basically the lie from Tel Aviv that any of this has been about recovering hostages, when from the very outset, they've been killing every hostage they can to avoid them becoming bargaining chips. And the part I'd really want to zoom in on here is in that calculus, in the policy to kill civilians rather than allow them to be taken hostage, is a reflection of the state's interests being elevated above not just the human rights at stake, but the interests particularly of these people that the state claims to be operating on behalf of. And this disingenuity, right? We're going to do all this to recover hostages while we're killing them relentlessly in order to keep a corrupt head of state in power. Is, you know, both ends of that are problematic. You put them together and it seems to me to be worse than the whole, worse than the sum of the parts, right? It's not just civilians being used as bargaining chips. It's not just civilians being killed by their own military. It's all that in the service of promoting corruption in office. And that totality to me seems to be entirely absent, even from international reporting on the genocide in Gaza. I mean, I've sort of given up any hope for American editors or journalists to demonstrate any modicum of independence vis-a-vis the military-industrial complex, but even foreign coverage has seemed to diminish or the recognition of this tension, particularly in Israeli claims to care about the hostages and be seeking their return, while also, on the other hand, you know, killing them from October 7th to every airstrike that's conducted in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. I think that was part of the purpose of that Hamas's ISIS narrative that we saw early on. It's just because you have to make, in order to, there's just been this concerted effort to make it seem like Hamas can't be bargained with or negotiated with. But in reality, Hamas was offering ceasefire and prisoner exchange deals literally since October 7th, I think, or at least since October 9th or 10th, according to one representative for the hostages' families. I think he's a lawyer. But one quote that I was just looking up now is, I wrote in, so it's, you're right, exactly, on the frustrations with the American international media to take the Israeli government's clear cynical interests but still interpret their statements about the Israeli hostages as genuine.
Right.
But there's already tons of information, evidence out there that they don't give a shit. They said, so in October, Israel's now former UN ambassador Gilad Erdan, who's one of the most despicable figures. If I pronounce his name, I don't apologize. He said, quote, "Everyone who was abducted, we want to see them back home, but right now our focus is to obliterate Hamas terrorist capabilities." And then a former Israeli hostage negotiator, Gerson Baskin, who I do apologize if I mispronounced his name because he does seem pretty cool, admitted that he said that a military offensive in Gaza, Israeli started bombing Gaza right away on October 7th, but it was like October 20 something that they began their actual ground invasion. And right before that, this former hostage negotiator, he said, Israel's primary objective today is to remove Hamas from its ability to govern. That means that hostages may be sacrificed. This is a guy who used to negotiate hostages on behalf of the state. Remember, the hostage exchanges date back decades, because Israeli mass incarceration has been a problem for that long, literally since 1948. Right. So, but even since 1967, it became more formalized that these prisoner exchanges would take place. And I think, the Hamas is ISIS narrative is just so incredibly destructive, just because, again, you're ruling out hostage rescue, basically, because you're saying that, at least through diplomacy, because you're saying that Hamas can't be negotiated with, when, again, one of their stated justifications for October 7th was to get enough bargaining chips, aka bodies, to exchange for the Palestinians, most of whom unjustly languishing in Israeli prisons.
Can I just pause to go back to one thing you said maybe 20 minutes ago, which was in 2023, before October 7th, the number of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli facilities was at a historic high. So you might think of October 7th as an entirely rational response to the preceding history in which there'd been multiple prisoner swaps. There's a historic number of prisoners now being detained. They take a historic number of hostages. There is a way this could have proceeded that would have been decidedly less violent, right? And minimize casualties throughout, and a track that very well might have returned those Israeli hostages to Israel, but that's not the track that Netanyahu chose.
No, it absolutely isn't. And even like, I mean, the political, interest at stake here for why he wouldn't be interested in hostage rescue is clear based on what you said. Right. But even if you look at like really narrowly on the munitions used in the ground, so Israel has used tons of 2,000-pound bombs, especially in 2023. And their justification for using such huge bombs, because keep in mind that when the U.S. and coalition forces were essentially leveling cities like Raqqa during his campaign in Iraq and Syria against ISIS from 2014 to 2017, the largest bombs they dropped on those cities were 500 pounds. And keep in mind that was a historically destructive, immensely destructive in terms of physical infrastructure, in terms of lives lost campaign in recent memory, one of the worst. Israel is not only, I think, like at least quadrupled the frequency of attacks of that campaign, and is using bombs that are 4 times larger. And Israel's justification is because Hamas has tunnels and they need to use these hardened steel cases. They need the penetrative ability, but that's where the hostages are held, in the tunnels. Literally all of them are. Or not, I shouldn't say literally all of them, but overwhelming majority of them are. So right. Again, these, I remember in November, Israel was bragging about killing some Hamas brigade commander. I forget his name, but he was in charge of the northern brigade of Hamas's military unit. And Israel was celebrating their victory, but the Hamas came out and said, "Oh, you killed a few hostages in the same strike." And then Israel denied that, told the hostages' families that it was Hamas that killed the hostages because the bodies had been found. But then literally last month, so that event was in November of 2023, and then last month, September 2024, Israel finally admitted that they were killed, but they said
airstrike.
There's a very high possibility that these 3 hostages were killed in an Israeli airstrike. So I tallied my last newsletter, Polygraph on Substack. Subscribe if you aren't already. I essentially, my goal was just to compare the amount of hostages that Israel held on October 7th, and compare that to the amount of hostages Israel held on October 7th this year, and do the same for Hamas. Mm-hmm. But I got sidetracked a bit. So the first part of it is just me looking at all the cases that Israeli officials at least confirmed or gently confirmed, let's say, of hostages being killed by Israeli fire, most likely or definitely. And I found 14 cases, 13, because one could go either way based on their stuff I've read. But Israeli forces have rescued 8 hostages by force over 1 year. And think of the death and destruction that is, those operations have caused.
Right.
They killed I think they killed 300 people in Nusayrat in June, maybe, I think. But they've rescued 8 hostages, Israeli hostages, and they've killed...
Well, 42,000 Palestinians are dead. Right.
42,000, yeah, and 52,000 if you count the ones who are presumed dead, who the Gaza Health Ministry doesn't even count yet, because they're presumed dead under the rubble, and right. Hamas is inflating the numbers. No, the destruction is just really bad. Right. But yeah, so even when you look narrowly at Israeli hostages, the priority is, you don't kill possibly twice as many hostages. What am I saying? Probably at least twice as many hostages as you rescue, if hostage rescue isn't the point. And right. Keep in mind that this is a very conservative estimate. This is just cases that Israel's acknowledged. Reminder that, about a third of the remaining hostages, there's 101, about a third of them are presumed dead, and Israel has recovered 37 hostages' bodies. Hamas says it's
and any number of them might have been killed in airstrikes too, right?
Exactly.
So
and keeping in mind that several Israeli hostages said they were almost killed by Israeli airstrikes. So I tend to agree with Hamas's numbers. Some that I think they're just flipping about. They said, oh, they're killing Israeli airstrikes, but I genuinely think that there's been dozens killed by Israelis, own bombs. Which, yeah, speaks to your point. I mean, this is just a cynical effort to prolong war at any cost, even if it's purportedly at the heart of their mission.
Absolutely. And we talked before about how some of the political interests in Israel driving this continuing genocide and the expansion of the conflict into other countries might inhere in Bibi Netanyahu's political interests. Let's just look at another sort of facet of that equation and just assess to what extent does anything that Israel has been doing over the past year serve its own security interests. So setting aside the head of state's personal political future in the face of these longstanding corruption charges that he's been ducking. If we just look at Israel's long-term security, do you see either the genocide in Gaza or the bombing of Lebanon or the bombing of Yemen or the bombing of Iran or the bombing of Syria as actually promoting security in any way? Like, we've been focused on the hostages. If we just zoom back and think less about Netanyahu, less about the hostages, and just look at Israel as a state that has a perception of its security situation and potential vulnerabilities. Is any of this making Israel more secure, or is it just unfortunately inviting more indefinite conflict in the future?
I don't think you can say it whether you're talking about national security or human security or any environmental security. I don't think you can, say that it helps in any way. It only deteriorates. I mean, Israel has already spent about 5% of its GDP, which is a shit ton. I think maybe even 6% of its GDP on its military already. Now it's way more. Its credit has been downgraded. Its economy is in turmoil. They're spending tons of money on this war for effectively no reason. They're being attacked more than they were before they started committing genocide in Gaza. And you're talking about the long-term interests. Like, of course not. I mean, look at all these quote unquote terrorist groups who have committed terrorist acts. I'm not denying that. But Hezbollah originated after Israeli invasion of 82. Hezbollah formed, I think, officially in 85 or 87 or something like that. But they were already resistant. The point is that there was resistance to Israeli invasion. Hamas, also late 80s, I think, that it was resistance to Israeli occupation, and also the simultaneous criminalization and basically outlawing of peaceful protests. That presented these groups with, and the people that join them with little alternative. I mean, the peaceful protesters are imprisoned.
And it was an American president, if I recall, JFK, who said something to the effect of, when you make peaceful speech impossible, you ensure violence as a result. It is striking the inevitability of this violence, and given the Israeli policy denying any opportunity for nonviolent assembly, speech, the rights of the press, the analogs of First Amendment rights that we enjoy in the United States. Palestinians have nothing like it, and it sort of ensures, right, that there would be some sort of unfortunate way for those concerns to find expression.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in terms of Israel's short-term security, like, of course not. They're being subjected to rocket attacks by Iran. Now, keep in mind that Iran is being very mindful of striking military targets. It struck one airfield. I think there's one viral clip of just like, it was actually, rolling aside, it was kind of pretty. So, seeing these it was like nighttime shot of these, missiles coming down and striking this military airfield. That one airfield, I forget its name, but I know it was the central location of most aerial transport of American bombs. So there's some sort of poetic justice. So that was the last time, you have to kind of scratch and claw to find these moments of hope, especially in this context. But yeah, no, there's no security interest. This is definitely not in Israel's security interests. It only hardened resistance over time, and obviously in the short term, it's being attacked more. Not in the United States' security interests either. There's been more attacks on U.S. personnel in the region. U.S. troops are in Syria and Iraq for reasons. You can get a different answer if you ask 3 different American officials. But for me, the answer is because empire perpetuates itself. So whatever the issue du jour is, whatever reason is the most convenient to give, that's why U.S. troops are there. But so they've been attacked multiple times, steadily throughout the Trump administration, throughout Obama administration, again, for multiple reasons. But the attacks on these troops really accelerated after October 7th. And for the same reason that Hezbollah started firing rockets into Israel, and the same reason that the Houthis started attacking commercial ships, to impose costs on either Israel itself or the people that enable Israel. So to carry out their genocide in Gaza. And I think the Houthis literally mentioned they're fulfilling their duties under Article 1 of the Genocide Prevention, the International Agreement to Prevent Genocide, or something like that, where they're fulfilling their duties to prevent it by making leveling costs against Israel directly and leveling costs against essentially the global supply chain.
To what extent, and given that the supply chain for Israel is global, right, and runs through Washington and Langley, to what extent do you see the events that continue to fester there indicating the possibility of another world war? I mean, I'm thinking back to the conventional wisdom on the origin of the First World War is that entangling alliances made it somewhat inevitable, as there was a spark in Central Europe. And in the contemporary context, the United States has this alliance with Israel. You were just talking about the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They have an alliance with Palestinians. You've got Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy force. Iran is the state. You got all these different actors with allegiances that are basically driving conflict. I would hope with all of my being that we are not, in fact, we're not marking the first anniversary of the Third World War. But to what extent do you see this conflict continuing to expand and engulf and suck in other countries and powers and non-state entities that might otherwise stand on the sidelines?
I don't know. On one hand, again, this is a no red lines policy. I mean, truly, like, Biden has basically, he throws out red lines every once in a while. But the most solid one that he said, that he backed into, was, we're going to contain this. It's not going to escalate into a regional conflict.
Right.
The regional conflict's already here. And
right.
he delivered $8.7 billion in military aid, which was part of the $14 billion in military aid Congress approved in April, right before Israel invaded Lebanon. So to the extent that Washington is willing to enable Israel to expand the conflict, to bomb all the countries that you mentioned earlier, I don't think there's any limits to it. I think there's a limit in terms of how many countries want to get involved from the West, and even regionally. Some of these Arab countries just can't. Others don't want to. Others have peace treaties. So I just see it more as, and again, I think I'm more scared about the Russia-Ukraine, U.S. involvement in that, in terms of escalation, because there's nuclear weapons involved. And I think Israel has nuclear weapons as well, so maybe I'm scared of that too, in this context. But I just think there's a limit on how much Western powers want to get involved in this, and a local appetite for it.
And to your point, France, just over the weekend, Macron indicated some daylight from Washington and called for a halt to arms shipments to Israel. So there's, I think, very much in that example, some proof of your point about a less robust appetite for expanding conflict in most of the West than we seem to see from Washington to Tel Aviv.
Yeah, and you look at you look at Ukraine, like, European countries are more interested in contributing to that, or at least their leadership is. I don't know how other people feel. But if you look at, you have lots of countries contributing material, weapons, ammo to Ukraine. But with Israel, I see Germany is a major contributor, UK, Canada, there's just not as many. And the other major providers, aside from Germany and the US, are at least suspending some transfers, like the UK, for example. Justin Trudeau announced that he was suspending a few transfers to Israel, although he left himself some wiggle room. So that was a commendable act. He's not someone you want to ask for Halloween costume ideas, though. Don't do that. But he made the right decision here. That was a throwback reference, wasn't it? But
we could treat that as an Easter egg for people who are paying a lot of attention to news cycles. Trudeau had a catastrophically self-imposed political crisis when some photos of him it was some time ago, right? But he'd basically dressed up in Halloween with blackface, if I recall correctly. And so when you have even people with that thin an understanding of racism demonstrating the independence to limit some weapons sales, while in the United States, with our performatively progressive or liberal political culture, caring supposedly about the appearances of inclusion and consciousness while disregarding the reality, right? I mean, there's an interesting contrast there to observe. I want to change gears if I can. Oh, go ahead, please. Please.
One thing I'll add is that one thing important to say that I forgot to mention as I was meandering with my answer there is Iran definitely doesn't want war, but they have to. Right. I mean, they had to respond to Israel bombing their consulate in Syria. They had to respond to Israeli aggression. So that's where I see it going, is that there is at least resistance on the side of Iran to try to keep this limited. What I fear is that there's no, aside from, vocal, like, oh, we don't want this to escalate, but like the no lines policy is just, I mean, it's loosely insulated container of nitroglycerin.
That's a great image. I want to come back on sort of two fronts that you raised there, and then we've got about 10 minutes left. So I just want to turn us a little bit. First, just on the subject of Iran, many Americans forget that the new Iranian leadership is decidedly more moderate than the folks who came before. And so allowing these repeated attacks on a country that has, I think, in multiple points in time, tried to demonstrate restraint is not only pushing the region towards expanding war, but it's marginalizing a set of leaders in Tehran who are more friendly to the West than their predecessors. And so it's driving more conflict in the longer term too, by encouraging political blowback in Iran to bring in more hardline right-wing militaristic leadership. And that, it sort of fits with this pattern of both in the short and the long term, seemingly all of the actors from Biden and Harris to Netanyahu, leaning into perpetuating conflict. I want to turn the lens to the upcoming presidential election here in the United States. And I'm thinking about the debate between Trump and Harris, where Harris pledges to support and deploy the most lethal fighting force in the world. We were talking before about Biden being outflanked by Reagan 40 years ago. If all of the major party political candidates I should say the corporate political party candidates in the United States are committed to supporting Israel come hell or high water, this no red lines policy. And Trump has gone so far as to say that Biden and Harris have been insufficiently supportive of Israel, and the Jews who support Harris, in his words, need to have their heads examined. We basically have the major party candidates outpacing each other as to who can be more belligerently supportive of international human rights violations. You want to talk about that?
Democrats just like it's shocking how willing they are just to go right. Like, Trump can, say just like something fleeting like Trump does, like saying, oh, they're anti-Israeli. And like, no, we aren't. And then Biden, Harris says, no, I'm not. And then she says something completely beyond the pale and, basically pledges to continue providing arms to Israel. Right. It's just so many. And you can see instances of that on immigration too, on fracking, all sorts of that stuff. There's just a failure. Look, progressive policies are popular. They're populist policies. I see why Democrats don't just lean into that, but from a logical perspective, it just doesn't make sense that if Democrats are interested in winning, they wouldn't just lean into a new vision that they're painting rather than just chasing Trump, defending on everything that Trump says, and especially right in the process.
Right. Well, and I particularly see this when you think about the interests of the Democratic Party or the Harris reelection campaign in the context of an uncommitted movement that has mobilized tens, if not hundreds of thousands of key votes in key battleground states. And yet still we see Biden and Harris sort of leaning away from their own political interests in inviting these votes and demonstrating some daylight from the would-be tyrant walking around with dozens of criminal convictions, who's the idea that they're going to compete with Trump to see who's more supportive of Israel, despite Netanyahu disregarding every supposed red line that Biden has articulated. It does suggest that the tail of Israel is wagging the dog of Washington rather than the other way around. And that inversion of the power dynamic, I think, is also lost on many American observers. And there's one last piece of this that I find particularly disturbing I want to invite your thoughts on. And it does seem that Netanyahu, by ignoring Biden and Harris's supposed red lines and continuing to instigate conflict, is to some extent politically banking on a return of Donald Trump to the White House. And of course, that could happen in either of two ways. He could legitimately win the election in November, or he alternatively might lose that election like he did in 22 and attempt to seize power in some manner analogous to how he tried to keep it when he was in office the last time. And so if you have an Israeli head of state who himself has been bedeviled by corruption charges, passing constitutional reforms to centralize his authority, instigating international conflict, unapologetically committed to a genocide, and then waiting for his lookalike in the United States to return to power. And this is a lookalike, mind you, who has overtly indicated his disrespect for democracy in America. Do you have any impressions of the respect for democracy in America among Israeli leaders?
No, I think they're. I mean, I don't think there's really any emotional attachment. It's very clear that what Israelis want from the U.S., which is essentially now, it's like it. Before it was just, aid. Like in early stages, it was economic aid for the most part, and then it became military aid starting in 1959, and then now it's like a lot of military aid, representation at the UN. To essentially be in its corner. I don't see any real respect for, I'm hesitant to use the phrase American values, but the values that we respect, you and I and the people, probably pretty much everyone watching this, respect as well, hold dear. I don't see any really respect for that. And it's funny, since you mentioned that Trump Netanyahu parallel, I can't stop thinking, like, isn't it funny how Democrats don't mention, when they talk about Trump coding out to dictators and autocrats, they don't mention Netanyahu,
right?
Because they're already way ahead of him on that. I'll let you go because I have a lot of thoughts flying around. So
fair enough. Well, go ahead and take the mic. We're right at the end of our time, so I'd love to invite you to share anything that you feel might have not come in to the previous conversation, or alternatively anything that you want our audience to take away from this conversation and sort of hold on to as a top line.
A top line. How about to wrap it up? I just float a weird theory and I get your feedback on it.
Okay, sure, sounds good.
Does Biden want Kamala Harris to lose?
Wow.
I'm asking this because you referenced the uncommitted movement. So in the Democratic primaries, you can call it that, but the primaries, that there were 740,000 ballots cast with uncommitted on them. Bombing the hell out of Gaza and now Lebanon basically rules out winning Michigan, a key swing state.
Right.
And it ensures that there's going to be a lot of Democrats. 77% of Democrats don't want the U.S. to send weapons to Israel. 77% of all Democrats. It's crazy. Like, you can't even get leftists to agree on 77% of stuff. And we're basically the same, although we do eat each other. But, so there's that. And even if people can, choose to see past it, there's an equal number of people in swing states like me in Pennsylvania who, let's face it, won't end up voting for Harris because she is just incapable of just clearing the lowest part of the ground, which is not committing genocide. So that's me either casting a ballot for a Green Party official or just throwing the ballot away. And you have people like that in Georgia too. There's groups of that like that in Georgia, and what the Biden-Harris is doing, they're running out of time basically to appeal to these voters. And plus, on the domestic front as well, I mean, restarting student loan payments and collecting interest on that. Biden basically having a Hurricane Katrina moment, which was completely preventable if he had mentioned a domestic proposal he released last October but never submitted to Congress that included $9 billion for FEMA for fiscal year 2024. That could be an awful lot of use now. He fought for the record, he fought for a foreign aid proposal that he released around the same time, which had $14 billion in military aid for Israel. So the priorities there. All this to say is that Biden is doing everything he can to essentially tank Kamala Harris's chances. What's your read on that?
Fascinating take, and
one thing I'll add is that Biden. Remember when like it was really he hadn't dropped out yet, but there's a lot of heat on him, and he had that like rally where he was like, they're trying to push me out and I'll never do it. It's like he was talking about like Democrats there.
He was talking about Nancy Pelosi was the one trying to push him out.
I think there's a lot of bitterness, and he's obsessed with his legacy, of course, and obsessed with, obviously, all politicians, at that level are touched in the head at some point, but, in terms of like steering towards sociopath, but Biden's pretty much there. So what do you think? Like,
it's a fascinating take.
Is he taking Kamala Harris's campaign?
It does seem to me, whether intentionally or not, and I think the theory you had about his, maybe personal distaste at having been pushed out, that might indicate a motive, so to speak. And there are certainly many opportunities, everything from Biden, supporting Israel despite this ongoing genocide, to the just complete failure of his administration to meaningfully shift the goalposts on climate chaos, which is now becoming a very not just poignant electoral issue, but a matter of life and death for millions of Americans, particularly across the Southeast. I'd also look at immigration. These are three different policy areas where you would be hard pressed to see any daylight between Trump and Biden. And the failure to differentiate those positions, the embrace of Trump positions by Democratic leaders, not only Biden, but actually also including Harris. I mean, the question that I'm starting to maybe re-articulate is, does Harris want Harris to win? Because she doesn't seem to be, her strategy to this point is, smile, act sane, act like an adult, draw the contrast with the guy who's a man-child on the other side of the ballot, and then just hope that that's enough. And, to many people, maybe it is. And to those of us who have principles or give a damn about anything, from human rights to the future sustainability of human life on the one planet we have access to, it's not enough. And I frankly don't think it should be enough. The fact that they are not outright unapologetic overt fascists, and instead they're covert, sort of, less braggadocious fascists, I don't think is actually enough. And so it does seem to me that whether it's Biden engineering a Harris loss, or, I would also say that to some extent, the Democratic Party institutionally is engineering at least a vulnerable campaign. Remember, Harris ran for the presidency in 2020, and she did not win a single state, including her own. And so, it does seem to me that Democrats have done everything possible to lose every election that they can get close to over the last, many years. And I don't see that pattern seeming to change at the moment.
To your point, to your last point there, the strategy that was reported that the people the Democrats running Harris's campaign, their strategy is to really hammer home during the last month of the campaign, which is really when you want to get the bread and butter issues. Their plan is to talk about January 6th a lot.
Great.
Which January 6th, according to polling, isn't even what most people think of when they think of the Trump administration. And another problem, cost of living issues dominate voter concerns. Every fucking poll you look at, it's at the top in some way or another, whether, it could be under economy sometimes, depending on how the question is phrased, or literally costs. I mean, food prices, average food prices up, food expenditures per household are up 30% since 2021. So food insecurity is up, financial insecurity is up, housing costs are spiraling. So you have these basic, fundamentals of life. And Harris really isn't bringing much to the table. Props to her and the child tax credit, a good, albeit unambitious housing plan. But this is not, she won't even talk about the public option for healthcare.
Right.
Like,
Right. Do you remember when Medicare for All was a conversation in the national political discussion, and now it's just not even discussed?
yeah,
While the medical debt crisis continues to expand across the country. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, so she's really bringing nothing to the table that will help people's needs to confront, the shittiness of everyday life. Like taking on like monopolies in the food industry, like the big food industry, that'll help. But you're trying to help people survive here, and you're really not giving them an outlet. You're not giving them much to look forward to, in that respect. So I think she'll lose. I think it'll be close either way. I think she'll lose. Not that anyone is asking for my opinion on the election, not even you.
No.
But I just thought I would throw that out there. I just see the neoconservative, if you want to call it that, foreign policy, along with just no plan domestically to address urgent needs. Not a winning combination in my mind. Are there chat questions we were supposed to answer?
There's one that comes to mind, actually, just very much on the subject that you're raising now. You're talking about the neoconservative foreign policy of Democrats and their failure to articulate a meaningful change at the domestic level that would help the subjects of the empire lead more sane or calm or abundant lives. When we look at the neoconservatism of the contemporary Democratic Party, one of the things that really jumps out at me is all the neocons from the Bush administration who are endorsing Kamala Harris. It's like the sky is down and blue is green, and we're being told by the Ministry of Truth to just disbelieve our eyes. And it fits in with that theme of today's Democrats having been outflanked on their left by Reagan 40 years ago. But do you have any thoughts about what we should take away from, for instance, Dick Cheney endorsing Kamala Harris? Like, what should we take away from that as it relates to your point before about voter hopes and hope and change, so to speak?
I think it's obviously Democrats' fault for just, accepting endorsements from literal war criminals at this point, Bush people. Yeah. And Kamala Harris doesn't, even if she accepted those endorsements, she doesn't need to fucking brag about it like she does.
Right.
Just bad look. But I think I think neoconservatives, like Trump's foreign policy is a disaster, and it is in many ways neoconservative. It is neoconservative. But I don't think like the Bush era people are as friendly with the Trump people. And right. I think they saw an opportunity to cement their power. Neoconservatives thinking in their own interest here, what they're interested in. And they think that they found a reliable partner, the Democrats. But I think about the Lincoln Project, like those type of people, especially Cheney. Yeah, that's how I see it. I just think, I think neoconservatives saw an opportunity, and the Democrats didn't take it as something bad, even though it was clear, like, infiltration.
Absolutely. But this also like speaks to limits of a two-party system and the inability of a two-party system to meaningfully represent a country with a broad range of perspectives. And if we look historically at the Democratic Party moving to the right under Bill Clinton to try to better embrace corporate interests in order to secure that funding stream that before was going, much more uniformly to Republicans. Similarly, now, if that was a transformation of the American political system in the 80s and 90s as it related primarily to domestic policy, we're now seeing a similar realignment as it relates to foreign policy, where yesterday's Republicans are today's Democrats, and today's Republicans are, like 1930 Germans, right? And I do think that there's as we're talking about discrete news cycles and elections, there are these broader patterns which escape attention, and journalists particularly usually only figure it out 20 years after the fact. And I do think that we're observing some really profound changes in the United States, and this co-optation of the Democratic Party by the neoconservatives, who, let's just remember, a former Democratic president beat in 2008 when Barack Obama won the presidency. He did it running against the neoconservative foreign policy vision, and he won, and he made such an imprint on the American political psyche, despite having some pretty profound human rights violations committed under his leadership himself, that now with Kamala Harris, the Democratic Party has essentially tried to, revive his image, and find someone who can remind American voters of Obama to the highest degree possible, while running entirely diametrically opposed to the vision that he ran on when he won the White House. And it does, to say that this is all a reflection of idiocy and stupidity, I think is too generous. But the corruption and the money behind all these choices, I think, is the sort of like unobserved part of the question. There's a lot of money in militarism, and the Democrats want it. And, that I fear is as simple an analysis that the party has. But in any case, I know you've got some other things to do today. Any last things you want to share with our audience while we're together?
No, I would just say follow Shahid's work, follow my work, support this podcast, because they bring on good guests.
I appreciate that.
Hosts. Yeah. That's all I have to share.
That's kind of you. Yeah, I do want to reiterate for the audience to follow Stephen's work. The work of his think tank, the Security Reform Policy Institute, is groundbreaking, really, really important institutional voice to support. You can find Stephen on Substack. And I'm excited to see David back here next week. I'm grateful to him and the team here at Redneck Gone Green for the chance to guest host. And I do hope that all of you listening can take away from this conversation a few reasons for distrust of the institutional politics that we're witnessing unfold across the country, and also that you can all look for some sort of local action opportunity, whether it's direct action, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's coalition building, building power from the ground up to displace the institutional actors that don't care about any of us or human rights or the future of our species on this planet. It is increasingly incumbent upon all of us to find opportunities for independent action outside the formal political system. And so I'm just really grateful for the chance to share some information with you all. And again, to the team at Redneck Gone Green for having me. We'll see you all next week. Same time, same place.